Questions 19 to 21 also require you to notice a key clue in the description. 19th century photograph. This image clearly shows four men crammed into a small, overcrowded living space, looking disheveled and exhausted. Now think back to two major themes after 1865: the Gilded Age, extreme wealth and poverty side by side, and the Progressive Era, reform efforts to fix problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. Question 19. Which choice do you think relates the condition mentioned in the question? As soon as you read the answer choices, you should notice B because it mentioned progressive reform activity. Given that the image was taken by Jacob Riis, who used photographs to expose the harsh condition of urban poverty, the progressive movement is a clear context here. Reformers like Riis wanted the public and government to take action, so B is the correct answer. Question 20. If you remember that Gilded Age created a handful of mega wealthy individuals while millions live in poverty, then A becomes an easy choice. The photo itself is a visual depiction of that contrast. It screens poverty, overcrowding, and poor living conditions. So the correct answer is A. Question 21. Here's where it helps to understand exactly what the question is asking. Advocates for individuals, such as those shown in the image, means people who wanted to help the poor, like Jacob Riis and other social reformers. What would those advocates have supported? They would have pushed for government intervention to improve conditions for the poor, housing laws, labor protection, sanitation reform, and etc. That's exactly what D is saying. Government should act to eliminate the worst abuse of industrial society. It also helps to recognize that B represents the opposite viewpoint, that capitalism without government regulation would naturally improve social condition. Reformers will strongly disagree with that idea, which is why D is the correct choice. Question 22 and 23 can actually be answered even without reading a single word from stimulus, if you know how to use the historical context. At first, the attribution might not seem helpful. I had never heard of John Muir either, even though history was my major and reading about US history is my hobby. But the date, 1909, tells us he was writing during the Progressive Era, and that gives us a big clue. Question 22. The question asks about a major change in Americans' views of the natural environment. Even if you didn't read the excerpt, you could still figure out the answer for two reasons. First, preserve wilderness area in a natural state is an obvious and sensible course of action. It's something most people would support, especially when natural beauty is at risk. Second, the Progressive Era, which includes 1909, was a time when the government took a much more active role in solving social problems and regulating industry. That's why C is clearly the correct answer choice. Also, think back to D in question 21, which said government should act to eliminate the worst abuse of industrial society. If you view the Progressive Era as a time when the government started stepping in to undo the damage caused by industrialization, then C makes the perfect sense. Question 23. Now, if you connect your thinking from question 22 to 23, the right answer becomes even clearer. Why would someone like Muir be calling for government protection of nature? because the land was being exploited by companies, cities, and industries. That's exactly what A is saying. Increasing usage of exploitation of Western landscape. If you're able to recognize a connection between 22C's preserved wilderness area and question 23A's exploitation of Western landscapes, I'm confident you will be able to spot similar connections when you take the real exam. Questions 24 to 27 require to read a few key lines from the stimulus, especially to answer question 25 and 27. But honestly, if you've done well on the previous questions, you could afford to miss up to 3 questions and still be on track for a score of 5. One helpful piece of information comes from the attribution. George Washington gave this speech in 1796, roughly 20 years after the Declaration of Independence, meaning the U.S. was still a young republic figuring out its place in the world. Question 24. Even if you weren't sure of your initial choice, once you read United States foreign policy decision in question 25, you realize that your answer needs to relate to that idea. From there, you can use the process of elimination to rule out the following choices. A can be eliminated because it's about domestic relations with American Indian tribes. B is also unlikely. Annexing Canada was never seriously considered in U.S. history. D involves Great Britain's treatment of American loyalists who had sided with the British around 1776. But by 1796, that concern was long past. That leaves C, which is the only answer about a real foreign policy debate, whether or not to support revolutionary government of France. That was a hot button issue in the 1790s, and Washington's address directly responded to it. Question 25. This is one of the few questions in which you really do need to read the stimulus. Check out this line. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nation is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. That sentence makes it clear. Washington was warning the U.S. not to get entangled in other nations' political conflicts. That's why C is the correct answer. The U.S. refusal to join the League of Nations in 1919, largely due to a desire to stay out of foreign entanglements, exactly what Washington warned against. Also, notice B, which refers to forming NATO, is the opposite of Washington's advice. The U.S. actively entered into a political and military alliance, ignoring its warning. Question 26. This is arguably the most difficult question in the set. Reading the stimulus won't directly help. You need to understand U.S. political divisions at the time. Since the passage is about foreign policy, you can reasonably eliminate B and C because merchants and plantation owners would be less concerned with foreign policies than political parties. That leaves A, the Democratic Republicans, and D, Federalists. The correct answer is A, because the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, wanted the U.S. to support France in its revolution and war with Britain. They strongly opposed Washington's point of view of neutrality. The Federalists, on the other hand, agreed with Washington and generally favor neutrality and closer ties with Britain. Question 27. If you pick C for question 25 and read the relevant part of the stimulus, you'll remember Washington said that U.S. should avoid unnecessary involvement in foreign affairs. So now this question is basically asking, when did the U.S. most clearly go against that advice? The best answer is D. Involvement in the Second World War. After World War II, the U.S. became a global leader, joined the United Nations, helped form NATO, and took on a permanent role in world affairs. That clearly marked the recommendation of Washington's address ceased to have a significant influence on United States foreign policy. While C, with support for the League of Nations and the U.S. involvement in the First World War is plausible, the U.S. ultimately rejected the League, so Washington's advice still held influence at that time. Therefore, you can eliminate C. You can also eliminate A because westward expansion in the 19th century isn't about U.S. foreign policy. And B because support for Cuban revolutionaries is likely too minor to be seriously considered. Questions 28 to 30 include one that genuinely requires reading the stimulus since the attribution doesn't provide much help. But what about the other two? You can absolutely answer them if you know how to use the clues already built into the questions and answer choices. Question 28. It's important to understand exactly what the question is asking. How did the export of New World crops change the old world? It's pretty straightforward. If Europe receives more food from the New World, it will benefit from having more to eat. That leads directly to A, which says improving diets and thereby stimulating population growth. Meanwhile, B, C, and D do not focus on the main idea of New World exports affecting the Old World, so they can be eliminated. Question 29. This is one question in which you do need to read the stimulus. Look for the line, the colonists also inadvertently carry pathogens, weeds, and rats. That clearly shows European unintentionally brought disease with them, which devastated Native Americans' populations. So the correct answer is B, the population decline in Native American societies. Question 30. To answer this efficiently, start by recognizing the phrase, the Atlantic world. What does that mean? It's a historical term that refers to the networks and interaction along Europe, Africa, and Americas from the 15th to the 19th centuries, including trade, migration, and cultural exchange. If you understood that, then C, the phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange, should have stood out right away. Even if you didn't know what Atlantic world means, you could still work backward from question 28, which talks about New World crops affecting the Old World, a central feature of Columbian exchange. Once again, be wary of choices like A and D that use distractors such as Atlantic or the transatlantic, since the question is specifically about the Atlantic world. In other words, if A and D are the correct answer, it would be too easy. Questions 31 to 34. Once again, paying attention to the title of the map, British settlement of the 13th colonies, 1700 to 1775, is incredibly helpful for answering these questions correctly. The map is clearly about settlement in the colonies, and you can see the shading moving inland over time. Question 31. If the previous two question sets felt a bit challenging, you're probably relieved to see a more straightforward one here. If you remember what I said, about the map shows the colonies expanding inland over time, it's clear that A, inland expansion of colonial population is the correct answer. Meanwhile, B, industrialization, C, American Indian resistance, and D's decline of tobacco production are unrelated to settlement patterns and can be confidently eliminated. Question 32. The correct answer is C. The orientation of the British colonies toward producing commodities for export to Europe. Why? Because before 1700, most British settlers hugged the Atlantic Ocean. This reflects the early colonial economy, which focused on producing cash crops and raw materials like tobacco, rice, indigo, and timber for export to Europe. Settling near ports and shipping routes made economic sense. Exports were the priority. This question is definitely tougher and requires a solid grasp of colonial American history and economic motivations. Question 33. The correct answer is B. An increase in conflicts between British settlers and American Indians. It's obvious from the map that settlers were pushing inland into area where Native American population already lived. This inevitably led to increased conflict as seen in historical events like Pontiac Rebellion and many frontier skirmishes. Also, A and D aren't really about settlement patterns, so they can be eliminated. C is clearly incorrect since a decrease in the economic importance of slavery is far from the truth. Slavery was actually a major source of tension between the North and South throughout the 1800s. Question 34. This is best approached through process of elimination. A is more relevant. Economic difference in the mid 1800s, not the 1700s. B, colonist difficulty in effectively resisting the British military. And C, significant portion of colonists who remain loyal to Great Britain are about challenges in the American Revolution, but they don't directly relate to settlement patterns. That leaves D, growth of social tension between backcountry settlers and coastal elites. Why is D correct? As settlers moved into the backcountry, they became more economically and politically isolated from the wealthy elites along the Atlantic coast. This geographic divide led to tensions over representation, taxes, and priorities, which will flare up in events like Bacon's Rebellion and the Regulator Movement. Even if D didn't seem obvious at first, it's only answer that truly fits the consequence of westward expansion during this time. Questions 35 to 37 require to connect the dots between the questions, the time period, and the correct answers. If you can do that, you don't even need to read full stimulus or know much about John C. Calhoun himself. Just pay attention to the year in the attribution, 1844. That's almost 20 years before the Civil War ended in 1865. So it's very likely Calhoun is addressing the rising tension between the North and the South over slavery. And if you glance at the excerpt, Calhoun is clearly defending slavery, claiming that enslaved the Negro race had reached a high level of morals, intelligence, or civilization. Question 35. Even if you don't know who Calhoun is, the attribution helps you narrow down your choices. You can focus on C, Southern landowners, D, Northern industrialists, because they can be considered opposites. Given that Calhoun is defending slavery, it's clear that C is the correct answer. Southern landowners were the group that benefited most from slavery and would have supported the argument that slavery was a positive good. Question 36. The key here is to carefully read the question, especially the phrase, directly undermine Calhoun's assertion. Your task is to find the answer that weakens Calhoun's positive portrayal of slavery. That leads you to B. Many slaves engage in forms of resistance to slavery. If enslaved people were truly as content and uplifted as Calhoun claimed, there would have been no reason for resistance. The fact that many resisted through rebellion, escape, and everyday defiance contradicts his argument directly. Moreover, C. Evolutionist society encountered difficulty organizing in southern states could also be interpreted as the opposite of what B says, because it suggests that slavery was firmly established in the South. Question 37. This one should be clear just from the year mentioned in the attribution, 1944. By that time, the country was already deep in sectional conflict, with slavery at the heart of the divide. The correct answer is B. Increased sectional divisions between the North and the South. Calhoun's defense of slavery contributed to the growing divide as the South dug in to protect the institution while the North increasingly opposed its expansion. This kind of argument helped push the nation toward the Civil War. You could arrive at the correct choice B by eliminating A and D since they are not about the issue at hand, which is slavery. C can also be eliminated because the development of sharecropping and tenant farming in the South described conditions after 1865, meaning after the Civil War had ended.